Chapter 20. Time. Of course I'm up to it. The words glided out easily enough. The mission was saved, and James felt like a hero as Scott grasped his hand and shook it robustly. Reality dawned as James passed down the stairs and out of the education block. The sun was brutal, and the mountains of barbed wire lining the prison compound shimmered in the heat. The same light caught the powerful torsos of the predators scouring the yard, and the guns cradled by the hacks on the cell block roof. James felt smaller than one of the grains of sand under his canvas shoe, as he looked around and realised what he'd gotten himself into. A 13-year-old boy, alone against a black-hearted machine built to contain the nastiest people on the planet. For an instant, he considered running back to the office and telling John he'd changed his mind. He stopped walking, took a deep breath, and ran his tongue around his dry mouth. James thought about the moment he'd pulled the trigger on the guy in Miami, scared out of his mind. It had been a terrible experience, but he could draw strength from it now. He thought back to his training, all the seemingly impossible things he'd achieved when the instructors pushed him through the pain barrier. Whenever a trainee was on the point of giving up, Mr. Speaks used to scream in their ear, "This is tough, but cherubs are tougher." James had got so sick of the phrase he thought he'd never want to hear it again. But now the words felt like a comfort. He whispered it under his breath as he started walking again. "This is tough, but cherubs are tougher." The exercise yard was at its most comfortable in the hour before the inmates were locked down for the night. The sun was low, and a gentle breeze made the heat almost tolerable. James sat with Curtis near the chin-up bars, while Elwood and the others prowled for some unfortunate who'd failed to deliver his commissary package to Kirch's bunk earlier in the day. The two boys had been talking for an hour, sitting in the sand, trading stories, and getting friendly with each other. "So you shot 3 people dead and tried to blow your own brains out?" James said, giving Curtis a shocked look, as if this was news to him. "If I'd met you in the street, I'd never have booked you for anything other than a totally straight kid." Curtis smiled, clearly pleased to have somebody brighter than Elwood and Kirch to talk to. "We were always moving around when I was growing up. Canada, Mexico, even South Africa for a while. It was cool, just me and my mom together. But we had some close scrapes with the law. I started getting stressed out, worrying about what would happen if Mom got busted. Sometimes I got so depressed. The blackest feeling, like the whole world was closing in on me." "Did you see a doctor or anything?" James asked. Curtis nodded. "I've had every kind of pill going. In a lot of the places we lived, my mom would take me to see a psychiatrist. Every one of them acted like they knew what they were talking about, but they all came up with different answers. If you ask me, psychiatrists are a bunch of phonies. 2 years ago, it started getting real bad. I'd go to bed and stay under the covers all day. My mom took me to this shrink in Philadelphia, some hotshot she'd read about in a magazine article. He reckoned my problems were down to a lack of structure in my life, moving from place to place and not having proper schooling or relationships with other kids my own age. So he puts this bright idea in my mom's head to send me to a military school. I begged her not to send me, but I was a mess, and Mom had tried everything else, so she went along with it. The place was a toilet. They had me up every morning running laps, making beds, polishing boots, and that whole playing at being soldiers gig. One night, the commandant ripped into me for not knotting my tie properly. He gives me this little nail brush and tells me to start scrubbing out this whole massive shower room. I did it for about 10 minutes. Then I ran off, busted into the weapons locker and stole the commandant's car keys. 2 hours later, there's 3 dead bodies, and I've got half the Arizona Police Department pointing guns at me." "That's what you call chucking a wobbler," James grinned, making a mental note to mention Curtis's visit to the famous child psychiatrist in Philadelphia to John or Scott as soon as he saw them. "Do you still get depressed?" "Not so much," Curtis said, "though it gets really boring in here sometimes." James spent the evening watching Curtis's miniature TV and eating Stanley Duff snacks. Stanley's battered brother was back from the hospital. Raymond looked like he was going to cry when he saw that Kirch had stripped everything he owned from his locker. He didn't even have a change of underwear or a pillow. When James woke up, With his neck clamped to his bed and a cutthroat razor glinting in front of his eyes, he guessed it was Raymond Duff. But he was wrong. "You one of us?" James got a whiff of BO, a flash of grinning teeth, and the rush of sheer terror that you get when you think you're about to feel serious pain. "Are you one of us?" Elwood growled again. Curtis and the other skinheads were standing around James's bed, laughing. "I am," James said, though the hand crushing his windpipe made it come out as a croak. Kirch's arm reached over from the next bed and dabbed James's cheek with a wet brush. "You look too hairy to me, Rose." Elwood pressed the razor against James's skin, close to the point of making a cut. "What is this?" James gasped. "Come on, guys." "If you're one of us," Elwood grinned, "you gotta get rid of that faggot haircut." Kirch waggled a wet shaving brush in his face. "Cut my hair," James nodded, as Elwood let go and allowed him to sit up. "But can't you use the battery razor I gave to 8? Kirch, Curtis, and the 3 others who'd got out of bed for the occasion laughed. "Where's the fun in an electric razor?" Elwood giggled. "You're not scared, are you?" "Why would I be scared of you?" James asked, trying to act as though being woken at 3 a.m. with a psycho waving a razor under his nose was the kind of thing that didn't bother him in the slightest. Kirch moved in with the shaving brush and sploshed warm, soapy water into James's hair. After a couple of strokes, he got fed up and drained the whole mug of sloppy mixture over James's head. James screwed up his face in pain as it streamed into his eyes. "Better keep still," Elwood giggled. He placed the razor against James's forehead and swept it upwards. A soapy blonde clump dropped into James's lap. Elwood hacked off hair from here and there until James's head was a shocking mixture of bald spots, crazy tufts, and the occasional bloody nick from the blade. "Perfecto," Elwood said, backing away like an artist admiring a painting. The skinheads were cracking up as they sauntered back to their beds. When the others were lying down, Curtis came up with a set of battery-powered clippers. "You want me to sort that mess out?" James and Curtis walked to the bathroom. After James had wetted a towel and mopped the soap and blood off his head, he knelt on the tiled floor, while Curtis leaned over and finished shaving him bald. "So your brother's definitely not coming back?" Curtis asked, as he rinsed the clipper attachment under a tap. "With his escape record, and Stanley getting his neck broken, that hack Warren told me he's put in a request for Dave to be recategorized as a high-risk inmate. He'll be put in a single cell over on the Supermax block." "So the escape is off?" "It's hard without Dave," James whispered. "But my uncle beats the shit out of my little sister, and I really want to get her out of there. The thing is, Dave could have got a job or something, but I don't see how someone our age can survive on the outside without help." "You know what I said about my mom? Hiding out, living under false names and stuff?" James nodded. "I don't know where she is right now," Curtis said, "but I know people who can contact her. If we busted out together, she'd be able to set you up with a new life." "So now you want to escape," James said, trying to sound cynical, while containing the 10-meter wide smile that wanted to break out across his face. "I got nothing to lose," Curtis said. "They can't add 1 day to life without parole. So what if they shoot my ass? What's worth living for in Arizona Max? If I did let you break out with me, it's just you, me, and my kid's sister," James said firmly. "It's my show, and I don't want Elwood or any of those other lunatics muscling in." Curtis nodded. "But if I can keep my mouth shut, you'll take me?" "You can't get out of here without me, and I can't make it on the outside without you," James smiled. "Funny how life works. It must be fate. Or something." Chapter 21. Wednesday. 5 days later. James got hold of a spare bedsheet. When everyone at his end of the cell seemed to be asleep, he began cutting it into metre-long strips, using the sharpened end of his toothbrush. He ripped the cloth quietly, stopping now and then to make sure there wasn't a hack spying down from the metal gantry above his head. After he turned the sheet into strips, he took 3 pieces at a time and plaited them together for strength. When James had finished, he put the lengths of rope in his locker and noticed that sunlight was flickering behind the blades of the ventilation fans in the cell wall. He was dreading another sweat-soaked day inside Arizona Max, but if things went to plan, this would be the last one. James asked Curtis to hang back when the rest of the skinheads went onto the yard. The cell never emptied out entirely, but no one was paying attention as James pulled a strip of cardboard out of his shorts. "It's my visit today," James explained. "If I can get Lauren on her own for a few seconds, without my uncle, I'll tell her to pack a bag and expect us at the house at 3 tomorrow morning." Curtis nodded. "What's with the cardboard?" "That's how we're getting out of here." "Cardboard?" Curtis said, looking at James like he was insane. James stepped across to the emergency door in the middle of the cell. There were 2 of these sliding doors along the cell wall in between beds. They were designed to allow the PERT team to enter if the prisoners rioted and barricaded the main door, or as emergency exits in a fire. "How exactly do you plan to get a solid steel door open with a piece from a Kleenex box?" James grinned confidently. "Watch and learn." He checked the gantry to make sure there wasn't a hack around, then walked to the door and went up on tiptoes. He slotted the card through the gap between the top of the door and its frame and jiggled it in and out before tucking it back into his pocket. "Now we wait," James said, as he moved away and sat on the end of a bed. "This is your great plan?" Curtis asked indignantly. 30 seconds later, a hack walked purposefully onto the rail. He disappeared down a flight of spiral stairs behind the door. The door slid open 30 centimeters, and the hack pushed his head through the gap. He inspected the inside for signs of tampering before shutting it again. "What?" Curtis gasped as the guard walked back up the steps. "What happened?" "Remember I told you about that big-mouthed hack in Omaha?" "Yeah." "He always moaned about the faulty doors. Every door inside Omaha State had an anti-tamper device. If someone starts fiddling, an alarm goes off on the console in the cell block control room. They have to send a hack out to check both sides of the door and reset the alarm, but they're very sensitive. All it takes is a gust of wind or someone hitting the door to set it off. The hack said he spent half his life wandering around cancelling false alarms." "And the doors here are the same?" James nodded. "Exactly the same. And the thing is, the guards get so sick of the alarms, they assume every one is false." Curtis nodded. "That hack didn't even look over the rail to see if someone was waiting on the other side. Within a minute of taking out the guard, we can be up on the rail and tooled up with stun grenades and pepper spray." "And from there?" "You've seen how few staff there are on duty at night," James said. "If we rip off the hack's security passes and put on their uniform, I reckon we can bluff our way out of the front gate before the alarm goes off." "Definitely tonight?" James nodded. "As long as I get a chance to speak with my sister. Let's hit the yard." There'd been a knife fight between 2 rival gangs the previous morning. Everyone had been sent back to their cells and locked down for the rest of the day. As James and Curtis lined up to pass through the metal detector, all the other inmates seemed tense, like something bad could flare up at any second. As they closed on their regular spot by the chin-up bars, James spotted a kid balled up on the ground, sniffling. Elwood had just slapped him around in front of a dozen laughing skinheads. "James," Elwood said, pointing down at the ball. "Want to finish him off?" "I'm good," James said, waving his hand in front of his face. The victim was Mark, the friendly kid with the black eye who'd slept next to James on the first night. Mark had no relatives on the outside to pay in commissary money. This ruled out extortion, but didn't stop Elwood beating him up for fun. "Boot him," Elwood snarled. "You're such a pussy, James." James spun quickly and kicked Mark up the arse. He knew this would amuse the crowd, without hurting his victim too badly. The skinheads roared as Mark rolled over in the dirt. James pulled down the front of his shorts. "Now get out of here before I piss over you," he snarled. Mark scowled back at James as he scrambled to his feet and limped off. "Why'd you let him go?" Elwood asked angrily. James shrugged. He kept trying to find ways to minimize the daily violence without appearing soft, but he knew that the more time he spent with psychos like Elwood, the more chance there was he'd end up involved in an incident where someone got badly beaten, or stabbed. "So," James said, desperate to change the subject, "is there a riot going down, or not?" The prospect had been hotly debated in the cell overnight. Whenever there was serious violence, the hacks closed the yard and locked everyone in the cells. but locking inmates down for long stretches only fermented the anger. "I love riots," Kirch said, making a rare excursion into the world of speech. "Yeah," Elwood said. "You should have seen the last one, James. There were baton rounds whizzing across this yard from every direction. Boom, boom, boom. I was one of the last to make it back to the cell, and dudes were laid up everywhere, either stabbed or shut up." Kirch looked at the sky with a smile across his face. "Happy days," he nodded. "Easily worth a month of lockdown." James sat down in the dirt. After a week of Kirch and Elwood's bullying and bragging, he could happily have laid them out in return for 5 minutes peace. "The riot was the scariest hour of my life," Curtis whispered, leaning into James's ear. "I thought I was going to die." Elwood hid under one of the shelters. He was as scared as I was. James smiled. "What about Kirch?" "Kirch really is a psycho. I think he loved every minute." "We've got to get out of here," James said, shaking his head. "This place is doing my brain in." If the cell block was put back in lockdown, visitation would be cancelled. James wouldn't get to see Lauren, and the escape would be off. As the morning wore on, James got increasingly nervous. There was a fight inside the canteen when the first batch of lunches was being served. It was shut down while the mess was cleared up inside, and a rumour flashed around the yard that it wouldn't reopen. A sullen crowd, most of whom had missed their main meal because of the lockdown the day before, gathered around the prefabricated building, looking for trouble. Superintendent Frey prowled on the roof, watching the commotion through binoculars. James anxiously studied his body language for any sign that the cell block was going back into lockdown, but the canteen reopened and the backlog of prisoners gradually got served. When it was time, James enthusiastically walked to the reception room at the front of the cell block. Before entering the visitors' area, he had to strip naked and put his clothes in a cardboard box. After a body search, he buttoned on a pocketless yellow overall that nobody had ever thought to wash. The visiting room had tables for 6 inmates, but Lauren and a wiry FBI agent James had never seen before were the only ones in the room. James walked barefoot across the tacky floor and sat opposite them. Lauren leaned forward and gave her brother a hug. "What happened to your head?" Lauren gasped, looking at the 5-day growth of stubble. "You hang with skinheads, you gotta look like one," James grinned. "If I don't get out of here soon, I might end up with a tattoo." "Prison tattoos are very dangerous," the FBI man said stiffly, in the poshest American accent James had ever heard. "The needle penetrating the skin is unlikely to be sterile. You'd risk being contaminated with any number of infectious diseases, including hepatitis and AIDS." "I read my briefings," James whispered. "I take it you're my new Uncle John?" "Theodore Monroe," the stick man nodded as he shook James's hand. "But everyone calls me Theo. I'm afraid John Jones was compromised when Curtis saw him in the education block. Scott Warren already works here, and Marvin, well, it would obviously be inappropriate to send an African-American undercover pretending to be your uncle." James smiled. "So, are we expecting company in here?" "Scott organized the visiting roster so that it only contained inmates who never get visitors," Theo explained. "Are we being bugged?" Theo shook his head. "There is recording equipment in this room, but they need permission from a judge to switch it on. We have to get it every time Curtis's supposed uncles turn up." "You know that note you passed to Scott Warren about the psychiatrist in Philadelphia?" Lauren asked excitedly. "The FBI followed up your lead and found a picture of Jane Oxford." "At least we think it's her," Theo interrupted, reaching inside his impeccably tailored suit and pulling out a blurry colour photo. James stared at the face of an ordinary-looking middle-aged woman, wearing large rectangular glasses. The boy standing at her side was clearly Curtis. "It's a video surveillance picture from the first-class check-in counter at Philadelphia International Airport, a couple of weeks before Curtis was sent to the military school. Interestingly enough, the psychiatrist Curtis visited turned out to be on the board of directors at the military school." James laughed. "Curtis said psychiatrists are a bunch of crooks. I bet he earned a nice bonus for every poor kid he sent there." "The FBI have also traced multiple transactions on the credit cards Jane Oxford used to book the flights. All in all, it's a commendable piece of intelligence work. John Jones and Marvin Teller told me to pass on their heartiest congratulations." James couldn't imagine the phrase heartiest congratulations ever passing the lips of John Jones or Marvin Teller, but he got the point. So, does any of this actually get us anywhere? James asked. Perhaps, the FBI man said, as he swept invisible crumbs from his jacket with his spindly fingers. Even if your escape attempt fails, this photograph represents a significant breakthrough. What about the escape? James asked. We'd better still be on for tonight. I can't handle it in here much longer. I was scared about what might happen to me at first. Now I'm more worried about what I might be forced into doing to someone else. Things are on a short fuse out on the yard right now. There is no hold-up at our end, Theo nodded. There will be 3 staff on duty in your cell block tonight. Scott Warren, of course, the female guard, Amanda Voss, and lastly a man named Golding, who will be working at the cell block control console. You have to be exceedingly cautious around the control room. Golding will be within reach of an emergency alarm that can instantly deactivate every door in the prison, even for those with swipe cards. When you get out of the cell block and reach the staff lounge, you're unlikely to bump into a member of staff. I'm led to believe that the conditions are rather insalubrious. It's not the kind of place where you'd want to spend time hanging around after your shift. Apart from Warren, the only other person who will be on duty inside the prison and who knows about the escape attempt is a man named Shorter. He works inside the central prison control room and operates the staff exit door. As you know, Dave has certain physical similarities to Scott Warren, and the original plan was for him to show his face to the security camera when you pass through the main gate. Unfortunately, neither yourself nor Curtis are big enough to easily pass as an adult male, so we've brought in Shorter as an insurance policy. He's been an employee of the Arizona Prison Department for nearly 40 years, and we expect the inquiry into your escape to make him the scapegoat. Shorter understands this, but the FBI has agreed to offer to pay for his early retirement, in return for cooperation. So that should get us out of the front door, James said. What next? You meet up with Lauren, as per the plan. It is of considerable importance that you move quickly. Arizona is sparsely populated, and there are not many roads in and out of the state. You can expect police roadblocks to be set up on all the major roads near to the prison within half an hour of the escape being detected. I've already tuned the car radio to a local news station, Lauren said, so we'll know as soon as the alert goes out. Assuming you make it away from the prison, we're then relying on Curtis to find the way back to his mother, Theo explained. We recorded the conversation during Curtis's visit on Saturday, and he made no mention of the escape. Do you have any idea where you'll be going? I told Curtis we should go into a heavily populated area to minimize our chances of being recaptured, James said. Curtis says he knows people who used to work for his mum in Los Angeles, so that's where we're heading. He didn't mention the escape to his visitors because he knows this room is bugged. Don't forget, Curtis has spent his whole life on the run. He might only be 14, but he probably knows more about police and FBI operations than most major criminals. That's a valid point, Theo nodded. So is his plan clear? Has Curtis mentioned where any of these connections live, or how they came to do business with his mother? I get the impression they're bikers, James said, or ex-bikers. The idea is that we get out of Arizona as fast as we can. When we reach LA, we find a phone booth and start making calls. They spoke for a few more minutes about the finer points of the escape plan before the FBI man wished James luck and headed for the door. James gave Lauren another hug. Play it safe, Lauren said. Don't go getting yourself killed tonight.